In August 2012, a team of archaeologists punched through the tarmac of a Leicester Council car park and pulled a skeleton out of the ground. That skeleton turned out to be King Richard III, the last Plantagenet, the last English king killed in battle, dead for 527 years and buried beneath a spot where council workers parked their Vauxhalls. And the DNA extracted from those bones? It might prove that every English monarch since 1485, including the man currently sitting on the throne, was never entitled to it. Now, you've probably already watched a video about this, maybe more than one. And if you're the kind of person who reads comment sections, which, let's be honest, you are, you noticed something. People were angry, not about the history, about the errors. Basic, foundational, should-have-been-caught-in-a-first draft errors in the family tree. And worse than the errors? Every single one of those videos stopped at the exact moment the story got interesting. They showed you the DNA break, waved their hands, and never followed the thread to its obvious destination. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to get the facts right. We're going to be honest about what we can verify and what we can't. And then, we're going to follow that thread, past the Tudors, past the Stuarts, past the Hanoverians, all the way to King Charles III. Let's start with the bones. The Greyfriars dig was led by the University of Leicester, but the person who actually made it happen was Philippa Langley, a screenwriter and secretary of the Scottish branch of the Richard III Society, who'd spent years lobbying, fundraising, and being told by professional archaeologists that there was probably nothing left to find. On 25 August 2012, the very first day of excavation, the mechanical digger uncovered human leg bones. By the end of the initial trench, they had a nearly complete skeleton. An adult male with severe scoliosis of the spine, which would have made one shoulder sit visibly higher than the other. The skull showed catastrophic injuries. A bladed weapon had sliced away a large section of the base. Another blow had punched through the crown. An iron arrowhead sat lodged between vertebrae in the upper back. The hands appeared to have been bound. Every detail matched a man who'd died violently on a battlefield and been buried without a coffin. The University of Leicester announced the formal identification on the 4th of February 2013. Beyond reasonable doubt, the skeleton was Richard III. In March 2015, after a legal fight over where he should go, Richard was reinterred at Leicester Cathedral. Thousands attended. Beautiful story. Archaeological triumph. But the real bombshell wasn't the bones. It was what was inside them. Before we get to the DNA, though, we need to talk about the family tree, because some accounts get this catastrophically wrong, and it matters. Richard III was born on the 2nd of October, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle. His father was Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York. His mother was Cecily Neville. Full stop. Cecily was the Duke of York's wife, not his mother, his wife. This isn't a minor point of genealogical trivia. It's the difference between getting the entire story right and getting it wrong from the first sentence. Cecily Neville was born on the 3rd of May, 1415, at Raby Castle in County Durham, the youngest daughter of Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and Joan Beaufort. She was married to Richard of York in an arranged union in 1429. She wasn't even 10 years old. Together they had at least 12 children, including 2 future kings, Edward IV and Richard III. She was known as the Rose of Raby for her beauty, and as Proud Cis for her imperious bearing. She outlived nearly all her children, dying on 31st May 1495 at the age of 80. Richard of York's actual mother, a completely different woman, a completely different generation, was Anne Mortimer. Anne was born around 1390, daughter of Roger Mortimer, 4th Earl of March. She married Richard of Conisburgh, 3rd Earl of Cambridge, and died in 1411, during or shortly after giving birth to the future Duke of York. She never saw her son grow up. Her husband was executed for treason 4 years later. The young Duke of York grew up an orphan. Anne Mortimer was Richard III's grandmother. Cecily Neville was Richard III's mother. If you swap them, every genetic and genealogical implication that follows collapses. And yes, people did swap them, in videos watched by millions. Right. Now the DNA. The landmark study was published on December 2, 2014, in Nature Communications, led by Turi King and colleagues at the University of Leicester. 2 findings, 1 confirmed, 1 detonated. The confirmation came from mitochondrial DNA, the kind you inherit exclusively from your mother, passed down the maternal line essentially unchanged. The researchers compared the skeleton's mitochondrial DNA with 2 living people who could trace unbroken maternal line descent from Richard III's eldest sister, Anne of York. Those 2 people were Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker living in London, and Wendy Duldig, living in Australia. Both matched. Same rare haplotype. The bones were Richard's. The maternal line held. Then came the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome passes exclusively from father to son. If Richard III was a true male line descendant of Edward III, and if a group of living men were also true male line descendants of Edward III through a different branch, their Y chromosomes should match. The comparison group? 5 anonymous living men who traced their patrilineal descent from Edward III through John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, through the Beaufort family, and onward to Henry Somerset, 5th Duke of Beaufort. 4 of those 5 men matched each other, confirming their shared ancestry. None of them matched Richard III. Different haplogroups entirely. Not close, not ambiguous. Different. Somewhere in the chain of fathers and sons, stretching from Edward III in the 14th century, down one branch to Richard III, and down another to the living Somerset descendants, at least one woman had conceived a child with a man who was not her husband. And that child had been raised as the legitimate heir to a line he didn't biologically belong to. The researchers couldn't pinpoint where the break occurred. It might have been on Richard III's side, meaning one of the 4 father-to-son links between Edward III and Richard III wasn't biological. Or it might have been on the Somerset side, in any of the roughly 19 generations between Edward III and the living comparison group. The 5th Somerset man, who didn't match the other 4, actually proved a second, more recent break in that comparison line, confirming that these events weren't exotic. They were a recurring feature of human genealogy. 1 to 2% per generation. Unremarkable statistics, remarkable implications. Now, about the Blaeborn affair, briefly because it's context, not the story. For centuries, rumors persisted that Edward IV wasn't actually Richard of York's son, but the product of an affair between Cecily Neville and a common archer named Blaeborn. The timing? Richard of York was reportedly away on campaign during the likely conception window. Richard III himself used this allegation in 1483 to justify his own claim to the crown. Most historians treat it with skepticism. Such charges were standard ammunition in 15th century succession disputes. And it doesn't cleanly explain the DNA evidence anyway, because the Y chromosome break was found in Richard III, not just Edward IV. For Blaeborn to be the answer, you'd need to believe Cecily's infidelity extended to multiple pregnancies, or that the break happened in a completely different generation. It's a ghost at the edge of the family tree, persistent, unresolved, not the answer. But here's where things get genuinely interesting, and where every other video you've seen about this conveniently stops. Some accounts have gone further, claiming that a DNA study was conducted on the remains of John of Gaunt himself, supposedly narrowing down where the false paternity event occurred. This claim has circulated with increasing confidence. It isn't true. John of Gaunt died on the 3rd of February, 1399. He was buried beside his first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, in the nave of Old St. Paul's Cathedral in London. That cathedral was consumed by the Great Fire of London on September 2nd, 1666. His tomb was destroyed. When Christopher Wren built the new St. Paul's on the same site, whatever remained of John of Gaunt went beneath the foundations. No record exists of his remains being recovered, not then, not since. No English royal tomb has ever been opened specifically for genetic analysis. A search of peer-reviewed publications, University of Leicester announcements, and archaeological journals turns up nothing. No study. Not in 2025, not in any year. The most likely origin of this claim is a garbled retelling of the 2014 King et al. Study, which tested living descendants of John of Gaunt's line. Not John of Gaunt himself. His bones are gone. They've been gone for over 350 years. The Y chromosome break is real. A DNA test on John of Gaunt is not. So where does the break actually lead? This is the part nobody else finished. Let's follow the chain. Richard III died at Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485. His crown, literally, according to tradition, found on the battlefield, was placed on the head of Henry Tudor. Henry became Henry VII, and Henry's blood claim to the throne was, to put it generously, thin. His royal descent came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a great-granddaughter of John of Gaunt. But the Beaufort line carried a fatal asterisk. John of Gaunt's children by Catherine Swynford had been born out of wedlock. Richard II legitimized them in 1397, but when Henry IV confirmed that legitimization, he added a clause explicitly barring the Beauforts from inheriting the crown. Henry VII's blood claim ran through a line that had been legally excluded from the succession. What Henry VII actually had was a victorious army, a dead rival, and the political instinct to get Parliament to ratify his kingship after the fact. He married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, to unite Lancaster and York. The Tudor dynasty was founded on battlefield conquest, a strategic marriage, and parliamentary endorsement. Not unimpeachable bloodline, already. At the very first link after Richard III, the mythology cracks. Henry VII was succeeded by Henry VIII, whose 3 children ruled in turn: Edward VI, Mary I, Elizabeth I. When Elizabeth died childless on 24 March 1603, the Tudor line was extinguished. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. His claim ran through Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's daughter, who'd married James IV of Scotland in 1503. Notice, this transition passed through a woman, which means the Plantagenet Y chromosome was already irrelevant to the biological succession. The Stuarts brought their own paternal genetics to the English throne. Whatever the DNA break in Richard III's lineage meant, the male line had already been severed by the ordinary mechanics of inheritance through a female link. The Stuarts endured through Charles I, executed 1649. The Cromwell interregnum, Charles II, restored 1660, and James II, brief, disastrous. In 1688, Parliament deposed James II in the Glorious Revolution, inviting his Protestant daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange to rule jointly. This wasn't hereditary succession. It was a constitutional coup. Parliament chose. The Bill of Rights of 1689 cemented it. Parliament had the authority to regulate who sat on the throne. Queen Anne, Mary's sister, succeeded in 1702. She endured at least 17 pregnancies. Not one child survived to adulthood. When she died on 1st August 1714, the Protestant Stuart line was finished. And what happened next obliterates any remaining illusion that the British monarchy runs on genetics. The Act of Settlement, passed by Parliament in 1701, stipulated that the crown must pass to Protestant descendants of Sophia, Electress of Hanover, a granddaughter of James I. Sophia died weeks before Queen Anne, so the crown went to Sophia's son, George Ludwig, George I of Great Britain. Here's the thing about George I. By strict blood proximity, he wasn't the nearest heir. More than 50 individuals had closer genealogical claims. Every single one, Catholic. Depending on the count, George was roughly the 52nd or 54th person in the line of blood succession. He became king because Parliament had written a law that excluded Catholics, and he was the nearest Protestant who qualified. He spoke little English. He'd never lived in Britain. He showed limited enthusiasm for his new kingdom. George I, 50-odd places down the bloodline. King because Parliament said so. That single fact tells you more about how the British monarchy works than any DNA study ever could. The Hanoverian line continued. George II, George III, George IV, William IV. When William died without a surviving legitimate heir in 1837, the crown passed to his 18-year-old niece, Victoria. She married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. When their son Edward VII took the throne in 1901, the royal house technically became the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. That lasted until July 17, 1917, when George V, fighting a war against Germany, changed the name to Windsor. Same family, different label. The Y chromosome of the House of Windsor traces back through Albert to the German dukes of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. No Plantagenet patrilineage, not even close. Hasn't been for centuries. Charles III, who acceded on the 8th of September 2022 after the death of Elizabeth II, sits at the end of this entire chain. His legitimacy doesn't rest on an unbroken genetic link to Edward III. It rests on the Act of Settlement, the Bill of Rights, centuries of parliamentary authority, and the simple political fact that the institution endures because enough people accept it. So who should be king? If pure male line Plantagenet descent mattered, if genetics overruled law, the answer gets strange fast. Channel 4 explored this in a documentary called Britain's Real Monarch, which traced the Plantagenet line and arrived at Simon Abney Hastings, 15th Earl of Loudoun, an Australian, living in a small town on the other side of the planet from Buckingham Palace. Not exactly the stuff of coronation ceremonies. Other genealogists have pointed to the Duke of Beaufort's line, or various other descendants scattered across the Commonwealth and beyond, living entirely ordinary lives with no idea their bloodline connects to a medieval throne. The rightful king, by pure Plantagenet blood, might be running a shop in New South Wales, might be fixing cars in the Midlands. It wouldn't change a thing. Because British monarchy has never truly been about blood. It's been about law, conquest, and parliamentary will, wearing the costume of hereditary destiny. Henry VII won his crown on a battlefield. Parliament handpicked William and Mary. George I leapfrogged 50-odd people because he went to the right church. The DNA break in Richard III's lineage is real, and it's genuinely fascinating. Someone's father wasn't who history recorded, and that lie has been baked into the foundation of the English succession for over 600 years. But the monarchy didn't survive because the genetics were clean. It survived because the institutions were strong enough that the genetics didn't need to be. That's not a scandal. That's just how it's always worked. Subscribe for more stories like this.